Hey guys, Gavin here from Ultimate Reloader. It is time for an Ellie Wilson update. Specifically, in this video, I will give you the latest and greatest on Ellie Wilson gauges. I got three things to talk about. The first is a new material. Ellie Wilson gauges are now available in brass, and they've traditionally been cut from carbon steel, which is fine if you keep them oiled, but in some environments and when moisture is present, you can run into some issues with corrosion. So the brass takes care of that, plus the brass finish looks really cool. The second thing is Ellie Wilson now has a new type of gauge. It's called the minimum dimension gauge. This gauge is used to check a cartridge against two things. One is the SAAMI minimum chamber specification. So if your chamber is cut to SAAMI min spec or is larger, you know that that round will chamber if it fits in this minimum dimension gauge. And the second thing it's used for is to check cartridge overall length. That complements the case gauge rather nicely because the case gauge is all about head to datum or sizing length for headspace, and it's about checking trim to length. So if you have the minimum dimension gauge and the case gauge, and optionally, if you have the case gauge depth micrometer, you can check pretty much everything you need to know to have full confidence about your loaded ammo. And what I thought would be fun, this is the third thing, is I'm going to show you all these tools in action. We're going to do some 308 sizing and bullet seating and check to make sure that everything is capiche. Let's do it. Okay, so what we've got here is a previously fired piece of Starline 308 brass. We've got the case gauge and the case gauge depth micrometer. And we want to confirm where our zero is. And if we go and bottom it out against this test gauge here, it's right at the 1 mark and it's right exactly at 0. So that means when we drop our case, and we're just going to get a datum before measurement before we size here, we're going to pull the depth micrometer down against the gauge. We're going to see where we hit. We're at 2 thousandths above. So we need to bump the shoulder at least 2 thousandths to get back down to spec, although we could be a little more conservative with our sizing for a particular rifle. 1.5 thousandths total shoulder bump is going to be fine because it's relative to that rifle's chamber. Okay, so now what we're going to do is pop our sizing die in the press. I'm using the Mech Marksman here, great press. And we're going to smear a little bit of case lube on the case, size it, wipe off the lube. Don't want anything interfering with our readings here. Drop it back into the case gauge. And then again, we're holding the depth micrometer against the gauge. Now we're at about -3 or so. So we bumped it a total of 5 thousandths of an inch. And that means that we could back the die out at least 3 thousandths of an inch so that we're just flush with the top of the gauge. That's kind of the minimum amount of sizing that you want to do. So that gives us a good indication of where we're at there. And then if we flip the gauge upside down, we can check for our overall length of the brass itself, the trim to length. And we're even below the bottom step here, so we have at least a couple more firings left before we need to worry about trimming. So that's the operation of the case gauge. Now let's check the actual minimum dimension gauge. Okay, so we slide into the minimum dimension gauge just fine, and I can see that we're below that top step. Let's see how much below we are. It says 3 thousandths. So it's reading the same as the case gauge in that particular case. Now what we can do is we can seat a bullet, insert the seating die here in the press, seat a bullet. Now we have a dummy round that we could keep for future reference. We could take an O-drive measurement and see where that falls. Here we're going to put this upside down and we're going to see where the tip of the bullet is. And it looks just a little bit proud of the top here. And so I can crank my seating depth down a little bit and we can check that again. And it looks like now we're just flush or slightly below. So that tells us that this particular cartridge is going to be compatible with any SAAMI spec compliant rifle, and that is good to know. Well, that's about all there is to it. If you have the L.E. Wilson case gauge, the L.E. Wilson minimum dimension gauge, and optionally this case gauge depth micrometer, you can have full confidence in your press setup and in the ammunition that you're producing, and that is a good feeling. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to click that first link in the video description. I got a blog post write-up with a lot more detail here. Plus, you're going to want to make sure that you're subscribed to GavinTube with notifications. We're giving away something every week in 2019. And if you feel like supporting me, you can get an Ultimate Reloader shirt at the Ultimate Reloader store. You can support me on Patreon, and so on and so forth. Again, make sure you're subscribed. Until next time, happy shooting and happy reloading.